Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
Very glad you're with us for the Thursday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, and we're getting closer and closer to our biggest awards of the year for 2023. Tomorrow, it all comes to a culmination with our Person of the Year, our Turncoat of the Year, and our predictions for 2024. But today, our categories are focused on the media: most overreported story of the year, most underreported story of the year, and the best story of 2023. So, Jim, let's start with overreported. What's your choice for this year?
So, listeners, right before we started taping, Greg said that the pickings were slim in this category. I found mine fairly quickly. You might say I cheated a little because I'm going with an angle of a particular story. I don't think the overall story is overreported. I think it's just about right. I found best story of the year to be an absolute desperate scramble to go through all kinds of stuff and being able to find everything having some, negative consequence. And no, I'm not just talking about the Jets. So it was a tough year. But an overreported story. I think the single most overreported story of the year was coverage of the Israel-Hamas war from the Hamas-approved point of view from reporters in Gaza. I do not doubt that the civilian casualties in Gaza are severe and heartbreaking. I do not doubt that in the process of dropping bombs, you are seeing people get hurt. When Hamas operates under hospitals and Israel tries to strike those locations, you're going to end up with people getting caught in the crossfire, hurt in explosions, buildings collapse, etc. I'm not going to that all exists. However, everything you hear from the Gaza Strip is approved by Hamas, because if you report what Hamas doesn't want the people to hear, you get, at best, you get your press credentials yanked. Really, more likelihood they're probably going to come and beat your butt. So, just a couple of weeks before we taped this, you may have seen the coverage of the IDF capturing a whole bunch of Hamas operatives. They're concerned about them being armed, having suicide vests or hidden weapons or something. So they had to strip down to their skivvies, and pictures were taken of them. Now, I'm sure it's embarrassing to have to strip down to your skivvies. I am sure those people the Hamas fighters in that situation, feel humiliated and embarrassed and all that stuff. But that's what the IDF's got to do to stop these guys from having weapons. And yet this was treated as if this was this major human rights violation on the part of Israel. And again, I just kind of baffling at the sheer amount of outrage that can be ginned up over this, over a conflict that began because Hamas broke through walls, stormed into kibbutzes and at this giant concert, and raped and murdered so many innocent civilian people. Holocaust survivors, old women, children, toddlers, the whole variety. So, the entire coverage of Hamas, I feel it's been too credulous in the assessments of the Gaza health authorities, wink, wink, by that we mean Hamas, and the sheer degree to which Hamas's side of the story is taken at face value. The sheer amount of coverage, like the Hamas massacre, the Israeli counteroffensive against Hamas, these are all big stories, and I don't think the sheer amount of coverage is fine. But I think there's way too much that basically tells you the Hamas side of the story, and I don't think the Hamas side of the story is all that defensible.
There were people saying even on October 7th, how long before the media and the UN and everybody else turns on Israel? It wasn't long. And the talking points were in there quickly. And as you said, yeah, exactly. It's like, well, the Gaza Health Ministry today reports, well, that's Hamas. And you can't really believe what they say ever. So my choice is certainly not as significant of a story. It's very much on the petty side. And it flows a little bit from what we talked about with our underrated figure. And that was Ron DeSantis underperforming in his run for president for a variety of reasons. But at the beginning of the year, his numbers were quite good. He had just come off a very dominant victory in the Florida governor's race. And so his numbers, in some cases, were ahead of Trump. In some cases, they were very, very competitive with Trump. And over time, that has changed. But the media is clearly more concerned about Ron DeSantis becoming the nominee than Donald Trump becoming the nominee. They believe that Trump is easier to beat. Your mileage may vary on that. But they couldn't find really any scandal involving Ron DeSantis. So they made some stuff up, and then they just went after the most petty stuff. They kept talking about the so-called Don't Say Gay bill, which was not that. It was simply not bringing up that sort of material to kids from kindergarten to third grade, I think it was. So that doesn't seem all that radical. They yelled at him for picking a fight with Disney, but don't forget Disney picked the fight with him first. But then it got even worse. At least those were policies. Then we got his shoes, and we're still dealing with the shoes and whether he's got heels in his boots because he's trying to make himself taller. It reminds me of the Seinfeld episode where they were accusing each other of wearing lifts when Kramer had a friend who was little people. I don't know what you call them these days. But anyway, that type of character. And then the worst of all was the characterization of Casey DeSantis as Lady Macbeth. It was just pure sniping, trying to find anything and everything to target a guy that they were worried could be the nominee. The Trump campaign, of course, cozied up to the media as they did this because they wanted to damage the DeSantis candidacy in any way they could. Can't say that the attacks weren't effective. Not sure all of them were particularly effective, but the way they got junior high-ish or cliquish about going after Ron DeSantis for very petty things has got to be the most overreported thing. I mean, there were actually long. Remember, we did a Martini on the long Politico deep dive into the boots. I mean, we are facing many crises in this country right now, from national security to the economy to $30-some trillion in debt, and we're worried about boots. That's the media for you, trying to do anything and everything to distract you from the failures of the Biden administration and trying to ding the candidate that they fear might be the guy that runs against them.
Greg, those are excellent selections. And as you were, giving the first part of your answer, I was like, I should have picked DeSantis's boots. And or the theory that, he's got lifts in his shoes, he's actually a little bit shorter. Like he's at the NFL Combine, right? He's out in Indianapolis and they're, taking his measurements or something. I imagine some of that may be you write an article about it and it goes viral. This is the sorts of, shallow, appearance-oriented things that can go blow up big on social media, Twitter, Facebook, and stuff like that. I'm also going to make the observation that, like, let's say we want to talk about, what the U.S. should do in Ukraine, or what the U.S. should do with China, or the border, how to fight inflation. Like, to have a good conversation about that, you have to know things about it. And a lot of people don't know much about it. They just know they just have gut instincts. Does it look like he's wearing heels? Or what do you think of those white boots that DeSantis wore in the flat? You don't need to know anything to have an opinion on that. That's right. You could be the world's biggest idiot and you could weigh in on that. And those are the people who are weighing in on those types of topics. But I just feel like we in the media, our job should be kind of like try to elevate the debate. It should try to be like add some crunchy nutrients to what people are talking about instead of just giving them the junk food, the candy of here's a picture. What do you think of this? But that's the world we live in, Greg.
Yeah. And it wasn't like a 1 or 2 page story in Politico. I mean, you had to scroll and scroll and scroll if you actually wanted to read the whole thing, which we did a little bit just to mock it. But somebody actually spent a ton of time on that, and somebody thought it was the most important story of the day on Politico, which is absolutely absurd. All right, Jim. Well, we know the media has its thumb on the scale in terms of bias being committed, and sometimes it's bias in terms of what is omitted. So what's the most underreported story of 2023?
So for this one, I continued in the area of foreign policy, and I'm noticing that the answer is the U.S. relationship with China. And it's not that this doesn't get covered. I think it gets sometimes what I call check-the-box journalism. Sometimes you get deeper and more in-depth issues. But unlike the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where you have very dramatic pictures and visuals to go with it, unlike is the Hamas attack on Israel and the IDF's counterattack, like those, like there's an incident, like there's an inciting incident that sets the narrative. We are in this constant, I don't know whether you want to call it a new Cold War or burgeoning conflict or tensions or however you want to classify it. There was a lot of coverage, for example, of the Chinese spy balloon in the beginning of the year. And then you notice it stopped, right? There was no real consequences to it, even though subsequent reporting indicated that spy balloon was way more advanced than the initial assessment of the U.S. officials. They did get signals intercepts from U.S. military bases and things like that. Like the consequences were big. And I've got this other column in the works look, we're used to being the world's lone superpower. Well, in China, we face a technologically advanced hostile state that's got a new, longer-range hypersonic missile that is probably able to evade U.S. defenses. That's really bad. That's really ominous. They have a new high-altitude spy drone that travels at least 3 times the speed of sound, making it much tougher for the U.S. to track and to interdict. And they've got a nuclear force buildup that is on a scale and pace unseen since the U.S.-Soviet nuclear arms race that ended in the late 1980s. Now, you may have felt like, oh, I heard a lot of news about China this year. You probably didn't hear that much about that and the recognition that we are at risk of not having the biggest, toughest, strongest military in the bloc, and that they may have a technological advantage over us in certain areas. We haven't faced that since the Cold War, if that. And even then, people kind of knew the Soviet weapons were starting to decline in their quality. And then, of course, in the Persian Gulf War, everybody's like, oh, these things are junk. The U.S. has the most technologically advanced military in the world. Those are the people we want to buy arms from. So I kind of feel like the rise of China, it's not a hot war, but it is this burgeoning low-level one. I tried to do my part to add more understanding of it with my trip to Taiwan earlier this year. But I feel like, God forbid, China invades Taiwan or there's some other conflict in the Pacific. We're going to look at this and say, how did they sneak up on us? And they're not sneaking up on us. You're just not hearing about it because the media hasn't figured out a way to make this as interesting. Or it may be that, these media are run by large multinational conglomerates who have large investments in China and always want to look on the bright side of life, to quote Monty Python.
No, that's obviously our biggest geopolitical threat right now in so many different ways. The fentanyl that they're responsible for coming into the country, the spy balloon, which we keep being lied to about in terms of what it was able to accomplish, the saber rattling towards Taiwan. And if you haven't read Jim's reporting on that from a couple months back, I highly encourage you to do it. Their aggression in the South China Sea. I mean, everything you just mentioned. But again, it's one of those topics, like you mentioned in our first martini. It takes some layers, takes some nuance, takes, studying up on a number of different fronts and, whipping out posts you can put up there in about 30 minutes or 60 minutes just because you got a take on something is a whole lot easier. But these are the stories that actually matter in terms of the future of our country and the future of our world. I'm going to stay in the United States for this one, but at least on our way over to the Pacific. And that is the media just completely dropping coverage of the Maui wildfires. I mean, you remember these wildfires from this summer where these winds caught these fires and just absolutely devastated the beautiful town of Lahaina. Mrs. Columbus and I honeymooned in Maui, spent a lot of time in Lahaina. It was just a wonderful place, a ton of history, had a luau and all these great restaurants and everything. And it was just a devastating fire that took out so much of the town. For a long time, it was believed that hundreds of people, including children, might be missing. The media's only real concern on a national level was, when's Biden going to go? So he was at the beach, as usual, on the weekend in Delaware. They asked him about it, getting into his car, and he said he had no comment, which did not go over well. So then he scrambled to make a trip out there, and the second he left, we stopped hearing about the situation there. I had to look up, did we lose 1,000 kids there? What happened? They said, no, that didn't turn out to be true. But, the reckoning for not letting people out of town or upgrading the infrastructure so that electrical towers didn't fall and make the situation a whole lot worse. It just absolutely stopped for a number of reasons. Number one, they got their quick answer to their simple political question. And if I'm being totally cynical, it's because the leadership in Hawaii is almost entirely Democratic and there's no political hay for them to make out there. So could have gone with the border, which does get some attention, but given the chaos level there, it probably deserves a whole lot more. But I feel like Maui's a great encapsulation of the drive-by media and how once they figure out their little hook that they can solve in a week or so, then they just move on.
Greg, that is an excellent selection. And I just kind of would summarize it that the national media on the mainland loved the story of the Hawaii wildfires when they could say it was a cautionary tale about climate change and global warming. The moment it turned into a government incompetence story, the fact that they didn't use the sirens, the lack of clarity about evacuation instructions and things like that. Oh, by the way, this is the same state that had that false alarm about a nuclear missile strike a little while ago. The media lost interest because that's not what they see their mission is. They're not supposed to tell you, hey, your state government is full of, particularly Democratic state governments, are full of incompetent decision makers who have terrible consequences. They want to tell you, no, this is why you got to give up your SUV and your cheeseburger and stuff like that. Excellent selection, and wishing I'd thought of that, although I'm still fine with my selection.
No, you had a very good selection. Yes, but it's all about the narrative on stories like this. And, laziness on the story that you mentioned, because they don't want to do the hard work like you did. All right, Jim, let's cleanse the palate a little bit now. We've gotten through the overreported and the underreported. Let's talk about what you said was the most difficult for you, the best story of 2023.
Oh, God. First of all, this was an absolute rebuilding year for best story of the year, even more than the Jets. Because if the Jets were doing well, I'm mentioning that as my best story of the year.
Sure.
I looked at the Wall Street Journal's year in review of the biggest stories. Now, I had mentioned Elon Musk and the new management at Twitter as being a good sign. I really kind of stretch. I don't know if I could say it's the best news story of the year. Hamas and Israel. Look, the IDF looks like it's kicking Hamas's butt in certain places, but still a horrible story. Can't give the state of the economy and cost of living, and I don't think people feel like the economy is thriving. Maybe the market's having a good year, but still pretty darn well. I discussed China in the sense that it's still on the rise, still aggressive, still provocative. I was really glad to go over to Ukraine this year, but I don't think you can say that the war in Ukraine, certainly the counteroffensive, has not achieved what many people were hoping it was going to achieve. And it still looks like a long, bloody fight ahead, so it's kind of hard to say that's well. They mentioned weight loss drugs, and okay, fine, that's good. That's not really something we talk about on this show. Auto workers had a great year. The unions strikes, I can't say that was a great development of this year. You just kind of look at all kinds of areas of both foreign and domestic, the border. It's really tough to find good news, but I did find one. So my argument for the best story of the year, and again, probably underreported. Look, back in February 2022, Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine out of raw territorial aggression, a desire to restore a version of the Russian Empire, and we are told because he feared the expansion of NATO closer to Russia's borders. Well, he invades Ukraine to stop NATO from getting closer to his borders, and then as a direct consequence of the Russian invasion, Finland and Sweden, accelerate their process of applying to NATO. Finland is in, and it sounds like Sweden is just, one or two steps away from doing so. Because Finland borders Russia with 800 miles, now all of a sudden, not only is NATO pushing up against the border of Russia, it's got a long stretch of border that it shares now. And last I checked, 300,000 Russian troops are now in Ukraine. They don't have a lot of men to line up along that border. That's a very sparsely patrolled border on the Russian side. So I think it is good when autocrats and dictators launch territorial aggression trying to achieve a goal, and then they achieve the opposite of their goal. Instead of trying to prevent NATO from getting closer to Russia's borders, NATO now has a much longer stretch right up against Russia's border. Putin, you lose. It backfired. It completely generated the opposite of what you wanted. That's the best story of the year.
Kind of similar to the Bears and Jets offenses this year, unfortunately. But yeah, you want people to fail when their motivations for doing what they're doing are so craven. So definitely understandable that that's your choice. Mine this year is probably my runner-up for Person of the Year, honestly, and we'll get to that choice tomorrow. But and this might be, at least in part, the second time this person has gotten this story, at least an award. And this is Florida Congressman Corey Mills. He served in the 82nd Airborne Division for a number of years. He also served as a contractor in both Iraq and Afghanistan. He was part of Task Force Pineapple. Remember the people that went into Afghanistan as the collapse was happening and helped get Americans out, get Afghan allies out, and that sort of thing. And then he did it again this year. Now, as a Florida congressman, he went to Israel to get Florida residents out of Israel in those hours and days following the Hamas attacks on October 7th. Jim, we watch Congress, and for the most part, it's kind of like that song in The Music Man, Pick a Little, Talk a Little, and all they do is just tip, 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 just chatter and give their talking points all day long. But some people are actually willing to, go into action and not just talk. And Corey Mills has done it twice now to go get Americans who are stuck, certainly in Afghanistan and partly in Israel, you could probably argue, due to the failures of the administration. But having the courage, the organization, and the persistence to get the job done, that's my story of the year, getting those Americans out of Israel when there was a lot of uncertainty about what was coming next.
Greg, your best story could be the most underreported story of the year, and your most unreported story could be one of the best stories of the year.
Kind of crazy.
Maybe the media is too negative, but also, let's not fool ourselves. There's not. We very rarely have a hard time picking a bad martini for our daily show.
No, that's exactly right. Honestly, the most overreported story is probably Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce, but nobody really wants to go in depth talking about that on this podcast, I think.
No.
So let's just let that whole NFL PR stunt play out. Anyway, Jim, have a good day. Well,
look, it distracts Greg. Let's face it, the Taylor mania absolutely distracts from much more important issues, like how the refs called an absolute nonsense defensive holding on Sauce Gardner at the end of the Jets-Chiefs game, costing the Jets a chance to win.
Oh, yeah. No doubt. Yeah, the Chiefs get a few calls, and then for them to complain about them is always fun to watch.
They are the new Patriots.
Anyway, that's a tangent for another day. Tomorrow, Person of the Year, Turncoat of the Year, and predictions for 2024. Jim, see you tomorrow.
Are Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce going to be the people of the year? Stay tuned to find out.
There's only one way to find out. Jim Garrity of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks so much for being with us. She was Person of the Year for Time Magazine. That was insane.
Right, so Travis deserves it from us. That's balance it out there.
I just forgot about that. Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks so much for being with us today. Do subscribe to the podcast if you don't already. Tell your friends about us as well. Thanks also for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us also on your home devices. All you have to say is play Three Martini Lunch podcast. Follow us both on X. He's at Jim Garrity. I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a great Thursday. Join us again on Friday for our final year-end edition of the Three Martini Lunch.